There are several questions here sent by the same person about fallen beings. And I'm just going to answer them as one answer because they are somewhat related and they're also fairly short. So I'll just take them in turn. So the first one is, are many of the fallen beings in embodiment consciously aware of their agenda? Are the majority in embodiment actually being controlled by those in higher octaves? And as I've explained in my video about how the world was created, there are levels of the material world. The purely physical, emotional, mental, and identity levels. And there are fallen beings in all four levels. Some in embodiment, and some in emotional, some mental, some low identity. And I would say that the majority of the fallen beings in embodiment are not aware that they are being controlled by the fallen beings in the higher realms. And the majority, they are controlled. They are not aware of this. But of course, what you also have to add to this is that fallen beings are not aware they're fallen beings. They don't operate with that concept, and they would be very much in denial about it if you confronted them with it, and if they understood what the concept means, because they don't see themselves as rebelling. At least the majority of them, they don't see themselves as rebelling against the process of growth. They actually think they are doing the highest process of growth, the highest form of growth, by seeking to elevate the separate self to this godlike status. So they would not say that they are in a downward spiral or in an impossible quest. They believe that what they are doing is the right thing to do for whatever justification they have for it. And I believe they have to prove God wrong because God made a mistake, for example, by giving beings free will. So for the sake of the entire universe and even for the sake of God, they have to prove that this was wrong. It's just one among many of these justifications. So I would say that, the fallen beings in embodiment consciously aware of their agenda. Many of them are not. Probably most of them are not, because they are not really, at least they are not aware of the deeper agenda. Because again, even fallen beings in embodiment, they're of course not aware that they're fallen beings. So you can take a person like Hitler, right? If you had told him, you're a fallen being, you're totally rebelled against the purpose of God and creation, you're on a self-destructive path and it will just end in your own destruction, he would have denied this because he saw himself as doing something very, very important. I don't know if he saw himself doing something important for God, but certainly for humankind, by purifying the human race. So he thought he had a positive agenda. And he would have been very close to seeing that the fallen beings controlling him from the higher realms, they had just had an agenda of creating chaos and destruction and stealing people's energy. He would have been very reluctant to see this. Probably would have been impossible to make him see it. So again, most fallen beings in embodiment, they have a justification for doing what they're doing. And they think they're doing something that's positive, that's necessary. That's why you have a justification for war, for example, justification for torture, for controlling people, all of these things. Look at the many dictators throughout history. They all thought they were doing something absolutely necessary or beneficial, perhaps even beneficial for God's cause, like the Catholic Church for so many years, precipitating the Inquisition, the witch hunts, and all of this stuff that clearly could not have been justified by Christ, but they thought it was. So this was one question. Another question is, have any of the fallen beings from any of the previous spheres ascended? And as I explained in my video about how the world was created, we are in the 7th sphere that was created. And a sphere takes a very, very long time to fully evolve and come to the point where it ascends. And so there were 3 spheres where there were no beings that fell. But then in the fourth sphere, some beings fell, and in the fifth and the sixth. And, you know, the beings from the fourth sphere, most of them have the fallen beings, the beings who fell in the fourth sphere. They fell into the fifth as it was created. Most of those have now ascended. There are still a few that have become so entrenched in the fallen consciousness they haven't been willing to give it up. But most of them have ascended. And the same with many of the beings in the sixth sphere, because they've had a longer time to act out the fallen consciousness. And they've just come to this point where they've had enough of it. They can't do it anymore. It's become too stressful, too much of a strain on them to keep up this illusion. So, if you look at the total number of beings that fell, the vast majority of them have ascended. And there are, of course, even fallen beings in our sphere who have come to that turning point and who have then taken advantage of the path offered by the Ascended Masters to rise higher in consciousness. And there are talks that there are even beings who have, fallen beings who have become Ascended Masters in our sphere. There is a being called, an Ascended Master called Milarepa, who is known as a saint in Buddhism, that supposedly was a fallen being and who has now become an Ascended Master. So it's entirely possible that this can happen. And then there's a third question: is the obsession with genetic engineering a hallmark of the fallen beings? And yes, it is. But it doesn't mean that everybody who is working with genetic engineering is a fallen being. You can't necessarily make that leap. But it is because the fallen beings, at least some of them, they are seeking to control people. And the fallen beings, of course, don't have an understanding of the spiritual reality. What the Ascended Masters are given under their teachings, that everything really is up to free will, everything is a matter of your consciousness. So the fallen beings have a more mechanical view of life. And their dream is to control everything. And how do you control something? By being able to predict it. And how are you able to predict it? The more mechanical it is, the more predictable it becomes. So you have this idea that was dominating physics in the 1800s, that the universe is like a grand machine, a clockwork. And if you knew the initial conditions and the laws guiding the machine, you could predict the outcome. It's called determinism. And of course, this is an idea that originated with the fallen beings. I'm not saying that Isaac Newton was a fallen being, even though he was the one who sort of brought that idea to prominence. So, and this is their dream, to reduce human beings to be mechanical beings where they can be predicted. And they seek to do this through the psychology by all of these separate cells, because for many people, their entire psychology is dominated by these separate selves. And as I've said, the separate self is a reactionary pattern. It's like a computer. You push a certain button on the keyboard and a certain thing happens on the screen. You push a certain subconscious self and a person reacts a certain way. And so in a sense you can say this is mechanizing people in the psychological way. But the fallen beings are also dreaming about creating a mechanized race. They're basically dreaming of creating a human body that doesn't have self-awareness. Because self-awareness is what always gets the fallen beings, because you can, at any moment, a person, even though they have been controlled by the fallen beings for a long time, at any moment a person can wake up and say, hey, why am I doing this? I've had enough of this. I don't want to do this anymore. So they actually want to create a human body that is like an automaton, that just takes orders, that can be programmed. Like I said before, the Terminator movies is an example of this. Here's the perfect killing machine that can be programmed to kill, and it won't deviate from its programming. And this is what they would like to create, this army of robots, basically. They're biological robots that don't have any moral scruples, that will just mindlessly kill whatever they are told to kill. And so, yeah, it is an obsession with some fallen beings. It, of course, as everything the fallen beings do, it's an impossible dream. It can't happen. Because, well, there's maybe too much to go into, but, you just need to look at how complex the human brain is. And the complexity is what makes some people think, whether they're fallen beings or not, but some people think that the brain can function by itself. The brain creates consciousness by itself. And that's why they dream of creating this race of robots. That's why they dream of creating artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is also an attempt to create something that can do what a human being can do without the ethical or moral concerns, or without the self-awareness, without being able to rebel against it. That will mindlessly do what the fallen beings want them to do. But the complexity of the human brain also works against people becoming automatons. Because how can you predict something that's that complex? There are scientists who say that the human brain is the most complex structure in the entire universe. How are you ever going to be able to predict it? And the fact of the matter is that the human brain can't really do what it does if there isn't a self-aware, conscious being animating the brain, running the brain, giving energy to the brain. There could come a time, if we had sophisticated enough scientific equipment, where you could measure the total energy output from the brain. You could measure the total input of energy from the food we eat or other sources, sunlight or whatever, and you would be able to see that the brain produces more energy out than what's coming in through physical means. Which means that the brain can really only function when it receives energy from the emotional, mental, and identity realms. And this comes through a self-aware being that is merged with the brain. And without it, the brain just can live for a certain time. And in fact, if you remove that soul, the brain, as I said in another answer, can perform certain functions, but it won't be able to continue to do it indefinitely. It will run out of energy. So some of the higher functions of the brain will be shut down. It can still function at a sort of mechanical level, running the body for a long time, but the higher functions are not there. So in other words, the fallen beings can't ever really create this automaton that's controllable.